Gracias. Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Romer and his team at the Day of Knowledge for having me. And I want to thank all of you for coming. My story today begins with a stolen glance in a church. Although the Presbyterian Church in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, was known for its beautiful paintings and stained glass, on this particular Sunday, in the year 1882, Nicholas Dukes' gaze was instead focused on an enchanting young woman across the aisle. Her name was Lizzie Nutt. With her large eyes, light hair, and slender figure, Lizzie would have been hard not to notice. She was the daughter of Captain Adam Clark Nutt. Adam Nutt was a veteran of the American Civil War and now a high-ranking official at the Pennsylvania State Treasury. Nicholas Dukes had political ambitions of his own. The following year, Dukes would parlay his successful legal practice into a seat in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. But before Dukes courted voters, he first courted Lizzie. Such were her charms, Dukes once wrote, she could, quote, disarm the devil himself. That Lizzie would come to see Dukes as evil personified made his description perversely accurate. When Dukes proposed marriage, Lizzie eagerly accepted with hopes for a lifetime of marital bliss. But whatever happiness they enjoyed did not last long. While they were still engaged, on December 4th, 1882, Nicholas Dukes penned a scandalous letter to Captain Nutt that would forever sever his ties to Lizzie and the Nutt family. In this letter, Dukes accused Lizzie of premarital romantic indiscretions with himself. According to the letter, and we don't know if it's true, Dukes claimed that he had heard rumors that Lizzie was promiscuous. And so he decided, allegedly, to subject her to a test to see if she were a pure woman. In Dukes' letter, he says that on a visit to the palatial Nutt estate, he had been visiting with Lizzie, and in Dukes' words, quote, she came up and placed herself on my lap, as usual, and after fondling her for some time, I made a solicitation. To my infinite astonishment and grief, she melted down like wax. Oh, how I pitied her weakness. But where is there a man that can resist the temptation of such beauty and loveliness? You would have done as I did. But what was my horror and heartsickness when I found the signs of her virginity wanting. This was hardly the worst of Dukes' letter. He goes on to suggest that Lizzie has had some kind of premarital physical relationship with 6 other men, and suggests that she is pregnant by one of them, and advises Captain Nutt to arrange for his daughter to see an abortionist. In the context of 19th century social propriety, these allegations were astounding. Now, 20 years earlier, Captain Nutt had risked his life to defend the cause of the American Union in the Civil War. His daughter's honor now demanded nothing less. An enraged Captain Nutt fired back in a letter to Nicholas Dukes, quote, "You mistake the temper of the man with whom you must deal. You write to me as if you consider me a shameless coward. I shall convince you that I have the physical courage to espouse my daughter's cause and defend the honor of myself and family. I have always held that when a man invades the sanctity of a home, he takes his life in his hands. And under this code, I shall act. This Commonwealth is not big enough for both of us. With Nicholas Dukes' life, and more importantly, his honor now at stake, Dukes issued a prompt reply to Captain Nutt. In this second letter from Dukes, he writes, quote, "You appoint yourself a murderer and assassin with all the deliberation of a savage or a thug. Your letter would clear me if I should take your life upon sight. You want her reputation veneered at my sole expense. You want to blight my life forever for a cheap little cloak. No, sir, my honor is as dear to me as yours is to you, and I would prefer to die than to live a life of such shame." Shortly after mailing Captain Nutt this letter, Nicholas Dukes bought a gun. Adam Nutt had no need for such a purchase. He always carried a pistol on him. At the time that these letters were exchanged, Adam Nutt was away from Uniontown in the state capital of Harrisburg on official business at the Treasury. Now, Captain Nutt prepared for his journey home to confront Dukes, unsure if this journey would be his last. On Christmas Eve, 1882, Uniontown was awash in sunlight as Sunday morning bells beckoned the townspeople to church. But Adam Nutt had no plans for worship on this particular Sunday. Instead, he went with his nephew in tow to Nicholas Dukes' hotel room, where Dukes had lived for the past 8 years in central Uniontown. When they arrived at Dukes' door, Captain Nutt left his nephew in the hallway and stormed in. And I'll mention a couple images before I get to the action. This is an image, a cartoon that appeared in a local newspaper of Dukes allegedly peering into the Nutt mansion and seeing Lizzie allegedly involved with another man. Now, with the nephew in the hall, Nutt slammed the door shut behind him, and in Dukes' room, the captain began to beat Nicholas Dukes with a heavy cane. 2 other men and the nephew, hearing the scuffle, burst into Dukes' room and frantically tried to intervene. But Nicholas Dukes managed to steady his revolver and blasted the captain square in the face. Captain Nutt, falling to the ground, reached into his overcoat in an attempt to pull out his pistol, but he lacked the strength to draw it. His nephew held him in his arms and he said, "Are you okay? Are you hurt badly?" The captain turned his face, but was unable to speak. The bullet had entered just below the left eye, dislodged the eyeball from its socket, and penetrated the brain. The local doctor was sent for, and when he arrived, he found Captain Nutt spread out on Nicholas Dukes' bed, gasping for air. The doctor knew straight away that these labored breaths would be the captain's last. Within 20 minutes, Adam Nutt was dead. Nicholas Dukes calmly put on his overcoat, walked a short distance to the local jail, and turned himself in to the sheriff. As word spread through Uniontown that Nicholas Dukes had gunned down Captain Nutt, the news was greeted with skepticism. It simply did not seem believable that 2 men of such high status with no known animosity would engage in a fatal fight. They raced to the hotel to see for themselves. In the words of one newspaper, quote, "Strong men rushed to the hotel to find, alas, the story was too true. There lay Captain Nutt with a bullet hole in his head." Word spread across the telegraph wires throughout the country. And by the next day, the Dukes Nutt saga was a national affair. And as rumors spread about the substance of Nicholas Dukes' infamous letters to the captain, public opinion galvanized behind the Nutt family. A week after the shooting, the streets were teeming with onlookers because that day was scheduled for Dukes' bail hearing, and they wanted to get the first public glimpse of Captain Nutt's assassin since the killing. Nicholas Dukes was worried that he might be assassinated by someone in the crowd as he walked to the bail hearing, and so he quickly penned a last will and testament on an envelope. But for now, the crowd would be content to let the legal system run its course. After all, Pennsylvania law mandated the death penalty for anyone found guilty of murder in the first degree. Dukes walked to the bail hearing with the sheriff at his side. Dukes was clean-shaven, his clothing was dapper, as was his custom, and he walked with a brisk and determined step. Now, the judge set bail at $12,000, which today is nearly $300,000, or over 5 million pesos. And this is a high sum, but it was well within the means of Dukes' extravagantly wealthy stepfather to post. Dukes then took off for his stepfather's estate in the countryside, where he had an important decision to make. A month earlier, Dukes had been elected to the House of Representatives in Pennsylvania, and he, along with the other new members of the state legislature, were due in Harrisburg in just 3 days' time for their inauguration at the State House. Dukes had to decide whether he would take his oath of office amid this unprecedented public uproar. The town of Harrisburg was nestled on the Susquehanna River in central Pennsylvania, where the rough-hewn mountains of the west melt into the pastoral landscape of the east. And it was there, on January 2nd, 1883, that a state judge administered the oath of office to the incoming delegates to the legislature. But Representative Dukes was nowhere to be found. Apparently, the man standing trial for his life would not attempt to claim his seat in the legislature, at least not yet. 2 months later, on March 10th, the eyes of the nation turned to Uniontown. A man who had murdered the father of a woman he had promised to wed would stand trial in a court in which he was licensed to practice. Now, at the time of this trial, it attracted a massive horde of onlookers who packed into the courtroom. And the newspaper reporters stood by, ready to feed the American public's appetite for lurid details. Now, of the 60 men called for jury duty, 57 answered to their names, and of these, 12 were selected to determine Dukes' fate. Dukes entered the courtroom on the first day, looking poised, rested, and as always, clean-shaven. The court clerk recited the indictment against Dukes, and then asked Dukes to state his plea. At that moment, Dukes, who had been staring down, looked straight up, raised his right hand, and said, "Not guilty." His voice did not waver. "And how will you be tried?" asked the clerk. "By the laws of my God and my country. God send you a deliverance," the clerk replied. Now, on the third day of the trial, prosecutors for the Commonwealth, after the jury was selected, tried to depict Dukes as a murderous seducer who ruined Lizzie and then had the audacity to take the life of her beloved father. But, and I should mention that all of the witnesses to the killing, except for Dukes, testified that they had burst into the room before Dukes fired the fatal shot. But the defense insisted that its client had acted in lawful self-defense, and that these alleged witnesses to the killing had in fact burst in only after Dukes had fired the weapon, and he had done so only in reaction to Captain Nutt first reaching for his. In Nicholas Dukes' words, Nutt had, quote, thrust his right hand into his overcoat pocket and attempted to draw his pistol. It seemed to be entangled. I shall never forget the murderous look in his eye. The awful moment had come. It was he or I. A pivotal moment of the trial transpired when the prosecution moved to admit into evidence Dukes' infamous letters about Lizzie to the captain. It's important to understand that at this point in time, neither the public nor the jury knew with any certainty the contents of the letters, just rumor and speculation. The defense vehemently opposed the admission of these letters as evidence, insisting that they would prejudice the jury against their client without throwing any additional light on what had transpired inside Nicholas Dukes' hotel room on Christmas Eve. The judge considered the arguments, he read the letters silently, and then he decreed that the prosecution could indeed read these letters aloud into the record. Know that in this audience, awaiting this decision, were politicians who had helped Dukes secure his seat in the legislature, lawyers who had practiced law with Nicholas Dukes, parents whose babies Dukes had kissed on the campaign trail. And now they would all finally learn the truth about Dukes' graphic allegations against Lizzie Nutt. And as fast as the telegraph wires could carry the news, so would the nation. But first, the court waited for women present to exit. It would have been highly improper for any lady to hear such scandalous language. The lead prosecutor, William Playford, personally escorted Captain Nutt's widow from the courtroom, and when he returned, he picked up the letters, turned to the jury, and began to read. His voice was forceful, his pace steady. The audience was utterly transfixed and leaned forward to absorb every syllable. In the words of one newspaper, quote, "These were the morsels for which the packed courtroom had been waiting, and during the reading of them, the silence was so profound that a whisper could have been heard from across the room." While Playford read these letters, Dukes twitched sporadically, and Judge Wilson appeared on the verge of tears. Dukes' lead lawyer, a local congressman named Charles Boyle, would later sneer that the letters were, quote, read as if they were charged with nitroglycerin and liable to explode upon touching them. When William Playford finished, he took his seat, and spectators exchanged hushed reactions and glared at the defendant in disgust. On the fourth and final day of the trial, the crowd was packed so tightly together that one could not breathe without exhaling on those around them. Many who were unable to stand because they could not find seats simply knelt on their knee, ready to hold that position for hours on end. Amid the mass of bodies crammed together, the elderly could scarcely touch their canes to the floor. A Harrisburg newspaper reported, quote, "It was the spectacle of a lifetime for these people to see a member of their legislature tried by a jury of blacksmiths, miners, and farmers for the murder of another officer of the state." From on high, a grim-faced Judge Wilson surveyed the crush of curiosity seekers below him. Directly above his head, a portrait of a deceased Pennsylvania Chief Justice stared down at the teeming horde, with comparable solemnity. In the prosecution's closing argument, William Playford tried to redirect the jury's attention to Dukes' scandalous letters. He said, quote, "A man who could write these letters coolly and deliberately in his office is capable of the highest crime known to the law." Because I say, in these letters, he does worse than that. He deprives a family of its reputation, and he destroys its most sacred idol. I say the killing of Captain Nutt was but a trifle in iniquity and enormity. In the closing argument for the defense, Congressman Boyle posed a central question. Quote, "Who commenced that struggle?" I appeal to 12 sensible men. I speak to you in defense of this man's life. And I ask you, in view of the undoubted evidence, the undoubted circumstances, the undoubted truth, who commenced that struggle? After closing arguments, Judge Wilson ordered the 12 jurors tasked with Dukes' fate to go to the jury room and reach consensus on a verdict. The mass of spectators inside the courthouse watched intently as one by one the jurors filed out. The mob surged towards the exit after the last juror retreated from sight. Uniontown was abuzz with discussion of the trial as the village awaited the decision. Street corners were filled with people condemning Dukes. Everyone agreed that murder in the first degree was the only acceptable verdict. Even the old men of town shuffled away from their seat by the fire to join in the discussion. Now, Judge Wilson had decreed that if the jury reached its verdict before 9 p.m. that evening, then court would reconvene and they would announce the verdict that night. And so Uniontown was in a state of constant vigilance, for at any moment the chiming of the bell could begin to echo through the village. By 7 p.m., the jurors had reached their verdict. A court officer was dispatched to Judge Wilson's home on Main Street to alert him in advance of the tolling bell so that he could beat the crowd back to the courthouse. But when the townspeople caught sight of the court officer going to Wilson's home, they discerned the meaning of his presence, and a mad dash for the courthouse ensued. Shops were instantly abandoned. Newspapers with the most recent accounts of the trial were tossed aside. Diners sitting at the restaurants leapt up from their chairs, and their waiters sprinted behind them. Before the first ringing of the courthouse bell, the yard in front of the courthouse was packed with spectators. The deputy sheriff tried to keep the crowd at bay, but he was soon pushed aside, and the mob surged forward. Impossibly, more people than ever before crammed into the courtroom. Many found that their collars had been ripped off in the manic struggle. Finally, things settled down, and the proceedings were called to order. First entered the jurors, then the lawyers, and finally the defendant. Nicholas Dukes knew not whether he would live or die, but he approached his chair with a stoic face and a solid step. Now, I should pause and mention at this point that when Dukes was a child, he suffered from what today we would call tuberculosis of the joints, but what was known at that time as white swelling. And he had trouble walking. And one of the bigger boys in his class, James Hoover, would carry Dukes on his back to school every day. And the two of them forged a friendship that endured into adulthood. Now, Nicholas Dukes was on trial for his life. and James Hoover had become Sheriff Hoover. If Nicholas Dukes was found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to die, it would fall to Sheriff Hoover to hang his childhood companion from the gallows. It is an irony so perverse that if I wrote it in a novel, you'd tell me, Andrew, that's contrived. So what was the verdict? Not guilty. The crowd was livid. Uniontown exploded with rage within minutes. A dummy was dressed up as Dukes and dragged through the streets, and then in front of a manic mob, lynched on a tree. A second dummy of Dukes was set fire. On street corners, rabid groups of men gathered to condemn the verdict. Having evaded death at the hands of Captain Nutt on Christmas Eve, and been spared the gallows by the verdict of the jury moments earlier, Nicholas Dukes once again found himself in mortal danger. He successfully made his way into the custody of the sheriff. And I have an image of the notorious jury, as they were known. And here they are getting scolded by the judge after the trial. Dukes, for his part, waited inside Sheriff Hoover's parlor while the frenzy of mock lynchings continued out on the street. Finally, when the crowds dispersed for the night and quiet descended once again on Uniontown, Nicholas Dukes fled on horseback. And as he left in the midnight darkness, he passed the home of the man he had killed. Despite a snowstorm the following evening, the people of Uniontown gathered at a so-called indignation meeting to condemn the verdict. And the leading citizens of Uniontown, merchants, professors, newspaper editors, lawyers, came together to sign a declaration which read, "We demand exemption from the efforts of public officers," meaning the jurors, "to tamper with the behests of justice and offer as the only alternative the bloody arena at the shrine of Judge Lynch." Now, Judge Lynch was something of a term of art in the 19th century in America that referred to vigilante justice. But Dukes had already left and was at his stepfather's estate in the countryside, where he had an important decision to make. Dukes resolved to go to Harrisburg to claim his seat in the state legislature. When the Pennsylvania House of Representatives got word that Dukes was en route to the state capitol, it faced a difficult question. Should it allow him to take his oath amid this public fury? Some of the representatives suggested that they had every right to bar Dukes from their chambers, but others suggested that it would set a dangerous precedent susceptible to future abuse if they refused to admit to the legislature someone who had been duly elected and convicted of no crime. One of the most respected members of the House warned, quote, "Revolution may hang upon the precedent we now establish. We sit here as the supreme power of the state. In proportion to the dignity and greatness of this House, so should our action be careful. And if this man comes here with an even blacker character than that which he has, and I admit, it is difficult to imagine one blacker, we cannot, under the Constitution, expel him. Has he been guilty of writing immoral letters, of seduction, of the prostitution of every noble instinct of humanity? He has. But what weight should that have with us in comparison to the Constitution? But before the House could make this vital decision, the Speaker of the House read aloud a startling telegram. Nicholas Dukes would willingly vacate his seat. Although Dukes gave up his political aspirations, threats to leave Uniontown, these are the jurors fleeing from the train station, and this is Harrisburg, the state capital. So Dukes had given up his political ambitions, but he would no longer abide threats to leave Uniontown. He returned after several weeks and took up residence in his old room where he had killed Captain Nutt. And he began his law practice. Now Dukes' friends advised him to leave for fear of his safety. But Dukes remained adamant, insisting, quote, "I will live here or in the cemetery," end quote. And so Nicholas Dukes carried on, unsure how many days he would have above ground before an eternity below it. As the New York Times wrote at that time, quote, "He suffered the tortures of a living death." On June 13th, 1883, the day began as inauspiciously as any other. Nicholas Dukes, per usual, left his hotel at 7 p.m. and began to walk east on Main Street toward the post office to collect his evening mail. But on this particular night, waiting in the shadows of an abandoned storefront, was Captain Nutt's son and Lizzie's eldest brother, 20-year-old James Nutt. Now recall that on the previous Christmas Eve, the final conscious act of Adam Nutt's life had been to reach into his overcoat and draw his pistol, but with a bullet in his brain, he was unable to exact this final measure of revenge against Nicholas Dukes. Now, 6 months later, as Dukes unassumingly walked past the empty storefront towards the post office, James Nutt pulled out the very gun that his father had clutched in his death throes, and he fired the shot that Adam Nutt could not. The bullet tore into Dukes' back. As Dukes' lungs began to fill with blood, he began a staggered run towards the post office for cover. And as Dukes reached the top step at the post office door, James Nutt fired a shot that lodged into Nicholas Dukes' heart. Dukes collapsed face forward into the post office. It was there, on the floor of the very post office, where Nicholas Dukes had mailed his infamous letters to Captain Nutt. It was there that Nicholas Dukes took his final breath. When the local physician, Dr. Sturgeon, was summoned, he found on Dukes' body the very gun that Dukes had trained on Captain Nutt the previous Christmas Eve. And I'll mention, as an aside, about Dr. Sturgeon, which is a great name for a doctor, because it rhymes with surgeon. This happened in 1883. He was only 27 years old at the time. That doctor lived to be 105. He lived into the 1950s. There are people still today who live in Uniontown who knew him. It gives you some sense of just how recently this was, more recent than perhaps we realize. Now, Nicholas Dukes' arms were folded across his chest, a blanket covered his body, and he was taken to his room at his hotel, where his corpse lay on the very bed where Adam Nutt's corpse had lay just 6 months earlier. James Nutt, the son, who fired the fatal shot, he became a national hero overnight, a symbol of justice that the law had failed to provide. And the defendant in his own pending murder trial. And I have a few more images here. All of these images are from newspapers at the time. Now, Nicholas Dukes was a Democrat. The jury were 12 Democrats. Adam Nutt was a Republican. So although there's no actual evidence of partisan tampering with the jury, Republican newspapers had a field day. And here they show the Democratic donkey kicking over the scales of justice after he assassinates a high-ranking Republican. We have here the depiction in the local press of James Nutt's attack on Dukes and a portrait of 20-year-old James. Now, James, as he's sitting in a jail cell, awaiting his trial, as a national hero, as a defendant in a pending murder trial, strangers come to his jail to shake hands with him. Women cook dinners with him. He receives love letters from women he's never met. A local opera company even offers to give him a private performance in jail. He would soon get something better than a warm meal or a free concert. The legendary Senator Daniel Voorhees from Indiana agreed to be his legal counsel. Senator Voorhees had made a secondary career, when the Senate was not in session, of traveling around the country defending people who had killed in defense of honor. Now, the trial was relocated from Uniontown to Pittsburgh, some 60 miles away, because the prosecution felt that it could not get a fair trial in James Nutt's hometown. Now, Pittsburgh of the 1880s was a gritty portrait of industrialization. The mills, foundries, and factories that line the city's three rivers produced an insufferable cloud of pollution smoke that enveloped the city's 160,000 residents. The smog was so thick that it completely blocked out the noonday sun, and the city had to leave on its street lamps 24 hours a day. The Atlantic Monthly, writing about Pittsburgh at this time, in an article said that Pittsburgh was, quote, hell with the lid taken off. The British philosopher Herbert Spencer told the Pittsburgh business magnate Andrew Carnegie that, quote, 6 months here would justify suicide. Now, finally, on January 15th, 1884, the trial of James Nutt commenced. The courtroom was, in the words of one reporter, packed to suffocation. And by now, the Dukes Nutt saga had become not just a national phenomenon, but a global story covered on every corner of the planet, including right here in Mexico City. And I want to read to you the excerpt from a Mexico City newspaper, El Siglo XIX. Estudié español durante 8 años en la escuela, pero mi español es bastante mal y mi acento es más mal, entonces lo siento. El Vengador, su familia. Ha comenzado en Uniontown, Pennsylvania, la causa que se sigue el joven James Nutt, acusado de haber dado muerte a Nicholas Dukes, que había difamado a su hermana y asesinado a su padre. Dukes, miembro de la legislatura del estado, era odiado del pueblo tanto como es querido el joven Nutt, que cuenta con la simpatía general. Now, interestingly, James Nutt's legal counsel in this trial depicted him as both a defender of honor and as a victim of temporary insanity. It may seem odd to describe his vengeance against Nicholas Dukes as both an honor-bound duty and the product of a diseased mind, but this allowed James's lawyers to play to the jury's emotions while still maintaining some pretense to legality. In a hopeful sign for James, the newspapers reported during the trial that a man in Ohio, whom the papers described as a, quote, champion dreamer, had envisioned during a recent slumber an acquittal for James Nutt. And the pool halls of Pittsburgh were offering 3-1 odds that James would walk free. But these hopes soon gave way to trepidation as the jury failed to reappear quickly after closing arguments. Finally, the next morning, the jury reconvened to announce James's life and liberty. For 7 months, the world had awaited the trial of James Nutt. For 7 days, the world read in their newspapers the testimony, the evidence, and the arguments. Now, finally, they would all learn if James Nutt's defense of his family's honor would cost him his life. James was not seated with his lawyers, but rather locked in the prisoner's box in the courtroom. As he stood there, ready to confront his fate, the full gravity of the circumstances appeared to overcome him. Never before had James seemed so alone. "Prisoners, stand up," the court clerk instructed James. The clerk then turned to the jurors and asked, "Gentlemen, have you agreed upon a verdict?" "We have." "What say you?" the clerk asked. "Guilty or not guilty?" "Not guilty." 1,000 voices cried out in celebration. Many who had been waiting in the hallways of the courtroom heard the cheering inside, and they ran down to the streets to proclaim to the crowds waiting outside the courthouse, "Acquitted! Acquitted!" Word spread through Pittsburgh within a matter of minutes. The streets of the city exploded with jubilation. Some danced, others wept for joy. One of James's lawyer's sons ran to the lawyer's office where Mrs. Nutt and Lizzie Nutt were waiting to find out the news about the verdict. The son came in panting and exclaimed, "It's all right, it's all right, he's acquitted." Lizzie began weeping uncontrollably, tears of joy, and kissed her mother's weary face. Mrs. Nutt, moist with tears of her own, kept repeating the words, "Thank God, thank God." Congratulatory telegrams poured in from all over the country. The end of this nightmare had finally come, or so it appeared. There would be one final twist in the story of James Nutt and Nicholas Dukes that would forever change its meaning. After James Nutt walked free, he attempted an unprovoked killing spree. It turned out that his insanity was neither fictional nor temporary. So in the final analysis, what lesson are we to take from this sordid story? I would argue that it illustrates the necessity of the rule of law and the perils of its absence. The American founding father, James Madison, famously wrote, "If all men were angels, no government would be necessary." End quote. My friends, no angels walk among us, and so we strive to live by the rule of law. It is an ideal born of our eternal struggle against the devil within us all. Thank you.
For reasons of timing,
Yes.
later we'll invite you. You will be outside, and if you have, si tienen preguntas por razones de tiempo, que se nos pasó un poquito el tiempo, luego le vamos a hacer preguntas. Pero un gran aplauso, por favor.
Thank you. Gracias.